All right. We last week began a study, and I was told to speak up. And so if I'm louder than I normally am, I'm not mad at anybody. I'm just following instructions. And I'll try to remind myself I'm not a really loud person, but my children would say I can be if I have to be. And so I'll be a little louder tonight in my presentation so the recording can maybe be a little easier for folks to hear. But if that gets a little annoying to you, you let me know and we'll make a compromise of some sort to calm that down a little bit. We started a study last week looking at ethics and moral considerations in our 21st century. We will eventually look at some specific things that you probably anticipated us looking at, some key issues, some key challenges of our society that people seem to be accepting today that are not morally correct, even though our society has kind of redefined some things. But I didn't feel like that was where we need to start, because I think when you start with a problem and you try to work back toward the core principle that you are to live by is the wrong approach. I think you start with the core principle that you are to live by, and then you lay that foundation. Then it doesn't matter what the issues are. You know what the truth of the matter is. And you have the templates you can follow to be able to address any of those issues. And that's what we attempted to do last week, is just remind ourselves of the definition of certain things of importance to this particular study. When we're talking about morals, and basically boils down to the right and wrong of things. How do we know what's right and how do we know what's wrong, and who determines that? What are the considerations? How do we decide? And in a society that has skillfully, purposely, consistently, in a repetitive way, strategically remove God from a public discussion, it gets to be extremely difficult to remind a society. And so you and I have to be reminded, because we're the people of God. We have to be reminded, and it comes back down to us. We have to embody those things. We have to live according to those principles so that folks can see them in us. Certainly we're going to have to share them. We're going to have to profess them. We're going to have to talk about them. We're going to have to preach concerning those things, but they will not have an impact if we don't embody them. It's amazing some of the things that people don't know in our society today. Now, we can either bemoan that and we can be all upset about that, or we can just say, you know, if Satan and his forces can methodically, over a long period of time, accept incremental changes to our detriment, we ought to be methodical and consistent and be willing to take, even if it's incremental changes, back in the right direction, and us be consistent about it and persistent about it so that we can have a positive impact the way Satan and his forces have had an ill impact. I'm sure you are like I was. When I say you, I'm looking out at most of you. Look like you're, not all of you, I said most, so some of you who are younger don't be offended, but most of you look like that you're closer to my age, some a little older and some maybe slightly younger. But when I was in elementary school, we had Bible reading every morning. Now, this was a public school. This wasn't a Christian university. This wasn't a Christian elementary school. This was a public school. And in that public school, every morning before we started class, the Bible was read. I don't know who decided that, but that's just the way it was. In all my elementary school experiences, that's the way it was. We just accepted that. That means that in a society, it was accepted. As I got to high school, obviously those things began to diminish, and by the time my children were in elementary school, it wasn't allowed. What happened? And it's not my purpose in this class, it's not my purpose in life to campaign that we have to have Bible reading in public schools. I'm just saying, what changed? Who changed it? Somewhere along the way, somebody had a plan to change that. And they were consistent about their purposeful removal of that, and it got done. And it got done in some fashion so quietly and so skillfully that we just kind of accepted it over a period of time without a whole lot of fanfare. Now, I've shared this with you before, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I served on the school board for 5 years, and people assumed that I would reinstitute all those things in the public school, and that really wasn't my job on the school board. You know, we had very localized issues that we were dealing with, and but they were a little disappointed, you know, when they voted for this person that was a minister, and they voted for this person that they respected as a spiritual person, and that wasn't my campaign to do that. But here's the way I explained it to them. I said, you know, if enough of us study the Scriptures, and enough of us pray constantly to our Father in heaven, and enough of us are involved in the school system, it's going to naturally change. And I said, my children, I had one at that time in elementary school, and one in junior high, and 2 in high school. And I said, the Bible's in school every day because my children are there, and I've taught my children the Scriptures. And there's prayer in school every day. I know that because my children were praying people. And they prayed about tests and everything else while they were in school. I knew there was prayer in school. And that's not making light of the situation. I'm just saying sometimes we want to have an effect on a society in a legislative way. And it doesn't mean we can't be involved in legislative things. But you see, if we embody righteousness, it's going to be everywhere we are. And our influence, if we're engaged in things in life, our influence is going to make a difference. That's why we're starting where we are with these considerations, trying to determine what are the moral standards and how is that determined. You remember we mentioned last week from Matthew chapter 19 when what we refer to as a rich young ruler came to the Lord and asked what one thing he had to do to inherit eternal life, and he called Jesus good master. And Jesus said, why do you call me good? There's one good, and that's God. So if we're going to have a really clear understanding at a starting place for moral standards, we have to start with the one who's good, the ultimate standard of goodness. And this is not an oversimplification. It's amazing, and Brother Steve even mentioned a verse in his devotional last week and used that word good. It's amazing how many times that word is used in the Scriptures. But you have to start with that ultimate image in your mind saying, God is the holy, righteous, good one. And with that be the case, then we began to look and read in the Scriptures, and we began to look at societal ethical standards, and we began to make sure that the definition of morals has that background. You see, if it's just society determining what's good, our society calls things good now that they're not so good, are they? They call them good, but they're not so good. And so we talked about that last week. That has to be the starting place. And then when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus, the one that was called Good Master, teaches principles that disciples are to live by, and he tells them that they are to be the salt of the earth, but he also says you are to be the light of the world. Cities that are set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick. And so it indicates here that there's some reflective goodness on our part, isn't there? Because they'll see your good works, and what are they going to do? Glorify the Father who art in heaven. Now, these aren't our good works. They're not things that we've decided they're good. They're not things that we've defined as good. These are things that God, who is good, expects by God-like people. And that becomes a reflective goodness, and that's where we start. And so all these scriptures that are given by the inspiration of God were given for a purpose, a reason. That we be perfect, truly furnished unto all, there's that word again, good works. Where are you going to find the good works? Where are you going to find those moral standards? It's in what God's revealed. So you see, that puts me and you in a position of understanding why it is that we are to study. Not a bad word. You see, we want to study the Scripture so that we can know how God would have us to live. And that's what we talked about last week, and compared the good things that God created with Him looking upon His creation in Genesis chapter 6 and didn't see anything good. It repented God that He even made man, because man's heart was on evil things continually. Now, how do you go from everything God made is good to everything God saw, with the exception of Noah, evil? How does that happen? Not a trick question if you got a response to that. How does that happen? Is there a light switch somewhere that light comes on and goes off? Or is there an incremental change that takes place little by little, almost unnoticeable, a little bit at the time, until it gets so dark that God's not represented at all anymore? You see, those are the things we want to talk about, because we're in such a time, aren't we? That can be real discouraging if we're not careful. But if we go back and look at those basic principles, maybe we can find some understanding. So, that gives us a quick review of last week. So if you're talking about ethics, ethos, that ought to determine behavior, that's morality. That which ought to determine behavior, according to those things that we've talked about, with God being the standard of goodness and God's will being those things that we do that initiate good works, then you have those ethical principles that we are to live by. We'll spend some more time talking about that over the next few weeks when we contrast what's said in Galatians chapter 5, when he talks about those immoral things, those unethical things that will keep us out of heaven. That he specifies and said, they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Now you got my attention, because that's where I want to go. That's my goal in my existence, is go to heaven. And so if there are things that I would do or participate in or be influenced by that would keep me out of heaven, you have my attention. What are they? And how do we know what they are? And how do we avoid them? But see, we don't want to just focus on that side of what we are not to do. We want to say, is there anything that he says in that context would tell us what to do? He contrasts that immediately with saying, but the fruit of the Spirit is. And we're going to spend some time talking about that fruit of the Spirit, laying that foundation. So then when we do get into those immoral things, we'll know why they're immoral. We'll know why they're repulsive to God. We'll know why they can't be in His presence. It's not because He's mean. It's not because He's intolerant. It's because He's holy. And He's good. If we ever lose sight of that, then it's just a political argument for us. We just pick sides on who's the most tolerant and who's the most loving, rather than saying God is the essence of those things. So when you think about that, there's a certain behavior that we ought to have, and so morals are within a person, not something that can be legislated on a person. You're moral because of who you are inside. I think we mentioned this last week. If we didn't, we should have. You look at passages like Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, where Daniel is taken as a young man into Babylonian captivity. And here's a young man who has been made a eunuch. Here's a man who will never have anybody carry his name forward. Here's a man who's been separated from his homeland. Here's a man who is among foreign folks and having to do their bidding and carry out their work. But here's a young man in that context that had purpose in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself with the king's dainties or the king's meat. Now, what do you mean, defile himself? What concept of defilement would he have? Well, he knew God's standards. He knew what God said he could eat and what he couldn't eat. And in this foreign land, all he could control was Daniel. And where did he purpose that? You see, there were edicts all around him telling him what he's going to eat. There was already a menu for those Hebrew children that were taken slaves. It came from within. He purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself. And that's morals. And that's what we have to be aware of. What we get confused with is comparing that to the legality of things. Those are the demands that are from without. The reason we have to have laws are those who do not inwardly think like they need to think and feel like they need to feel and do like they need to do. So you have to have laws that punish those who do not act the way they ought to act. Now, most of our ought to acts are based upon our societal norms, our mores, our majority acceptance of saying we'll accept that behavior and won't accept that. And we know in our lifetime that's changed, hasn't it? And some of those things may be changed for the better, and some of those things may have changed for the worse. And so we want to pay attention to those things as we move forward. I started to do a little exercise, but I never know how you're going to be configured in here. So I directed camp long enough to know that sometimes your plans and these strategic things that you work all year for camp, you get down there and a certain makeup, disposition of young people can just reconfigure all that for you. And you just kind of have to adjust to the things. And so here's what I started to do, and I'll just see if I can create the image in your mind. And I was going to start on that side of the building. And you ever played I don't know what you called it, but when we were growing up, we called it the gossip game. And you would tell someone something over here, and they would pass it to the next person and to the next person and next person, and you get all the way to the end of the line, and you'd say, what was it that you heard? And a lot of times it wouldn't be anywhere close to what you started with over here. And so I started on this side I even had pictured Melanie starting this, and she doesn't have anybody sitting by her on the row, you know. And I thought if she's all by herself and I ask her to do something, she said, I don't want to do that, and it just messed up the whole thing. And so nobody's sitting with her, so I won't put her on the spot. But I was going to start over there and just share the ultimate standard of morality with her. Just verbalize it, let her repeat it to everybody, and just see if we got all those principles back to here. Then I was going to start over there and even thought about Brother James sitting there, and I kind of visualizing where you'd sit, and so everybody kind of reconfigured a little bit, and I was going to hand him this and say, just pass it down all the way across till it gets right here. And you see what I would have told Melanie is what's written on here. And since it's written, I had every confidence that once it got here, it was going to be the same. It's written. I suspected, not because Melanie wouldn't repeat what I said, but somewhere along the way, and here's what you would have shared. When you think about who God is and what God stands for, you know, He is the essence of goodness, isn't He? When you look at that passage we mentioned from Matthew chapter 19 and verse 17, and that passage from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14 and following, you know that He is the essence of everything that's righteous and pure and holy. So here's what it would have said. It does say on the paper, I was going to test and see if it passed through enough people if we got all these principles. But God is true, honest, just, pure, love, good. You see what the Scriptures describe Him as. Probably what would have happened, we'd verbalize that, we would have held on to some of those, but probably wouldn't have had all 6 of them by the time we got here. Because maybe being on the spot and knowing, okay, I've got to tell this person, we might not have held on to every bit of that, which illustrates to us, if we don't spend time in what's written, if we're just totally dependent upon the sermons from the pulpit or the messages from the class or conversation from our parents or our memory from our childhood, the likelihood of us holding on to those moral standards become very, very vague, very watered down. And we say general things about moral standards, but eventually when somebody tests us on it, we're not confident enough to say, no, that's not right, because that's where we have to be. You see, there's a God-likeness that you and I have to have. We have to be like Him. That means we have to live in a way that we understand that becomes the means of our goodness. Within ourselves and by ourselves, there is no goodness. But by the means that God provides, there is goodness. One of my favorite passages is found in Titus chapter 2. And I've got verse 12 on your screen, but you're probably more familiar with verse 11. The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men. Now that's where we all like to focus, because we're not going to be saved without grace. And God's grace of salvation was intended for all men. But verse 12 says, teaching us. That grace of God that brings salvation teaches us. Now notice what it teaches us. It teaches us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Now the way you know that and the way I know that is it's written. Now I was taught that as a child. But I was taught that because my mother read the Scriptures every night before we'd fall asleep. And so I had those things, but I couldn't just depend on that. I did memorize some of those verses, and my mother did put those in real life context, and she'd remind me of what the Scriptures taught in the context where I was misbehaving. And she'd make application of those principles. And I still remember a lot of those principles today, but if I was just dependent upon those things, and I never, ever followed up on reading that book myself and being reminded constantly and daily of what that book says, then guess what? The grace of God that can save my soul and instruct me in the right way, I can forget it. I can slip in those areas and I could get vague to me. And I might not deny things in my life that God just will not tolerate and will not have, and therefore I cannot be saved. You see, if I'm going to be saved, I have to know what He will accept and what He won't accept, and there's certain things I have to deny. But then He also said that I am to live soberly and righteously and godly, and there's that God-likeness. Now, if I live godly, that means I reflect that goodness of God, doesn't it? We probably all know people who have done good things. Maybe they're very charitable. Maybe they're very benevolent. But they're really not connected to God at all. And so in our minds we might say, now, he's a good man. Well, in world standards, he might be a good man. But who's getting the glory for that? He is. But you see, this goodness that we're talking about, who gets the glory for that? God does. Because it tells us how to be saved, and it tells us how to reflect that salvation so other people can be saved. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. After Paul said in verse 1 that he was begging the Roman Christians that they would offer their bodies as living sacrifices unto God, which was their reasonable service. But then he said, be not conformed to this world. Does that leave you the impression that the world might be trying to get you to conform? Does that leave you with the impression that there is a contrast between what the world may want you to do and what God wants you to do? We shouldn't be shocked by that. So he said, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you might prove. Here's a test for you. Here's a way that you can say what is accepted and what's not accepted. That you might be able to prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Does it bring you the comfort that it brings me to know that I can know it? That I can know the difference? I've had folks, I'm talking about spiritual folks, church folks, say, I don't know, it's just too complicated. I don't want to get into all those things, and people are going to believe what they want to believe, and I'm going to believe what I want to believe. I just don't want to get into that. That's just a really easy way out. You see, Satan and his forces that changed our environment to be ungodly were more persistent than that. They knew what they wanted to accomplish. And they were willing to make those changes very incrementally and be patient over a great number of years and change the whole educational system. They had a plan in mind, and they were going to stick with the plan. And to their credit, they did. Did it have an effect? Did a large portion of our society conform to it? And they're doing all these surveys all the time. They'll say, this particular age group, and we're all kind of named. And I'm in that baby boomer, and now we're going to break the system. They're blaming it on us. They named us. We're the largest population of this society, and now we're getting retirement age, and they said they're going to bust the whole system. There's so many of them. But when we were paying those taxes and all those things, they were kind of pleased with us. Well, we don't have to worry about Social Security right now because all these baby boomers started to work, and now it's going to be okay, but now all of a sudden we're going to break the system. Too many of us. And those who are younger than us, they do all these surveys, and I didn't mean to get off on my soapbox of that. I just happen to be one of them, and so all of us have names, but they do surveys on all of us, and they ask questions about what bothers and what doesn't, and it's kind of amazing to watch that deterioration of morals and the acceptance of worldly things. And we can just bash that generation of folks, or we can say, how did that happen? Satan knew it was going to happen. He planned for it to happen. He instructed them how to feel that way. And sometimes we get a little fatigued and we don't go to those same efforts to say, hey, I'm going to make sure if my children don't know anything else, they're going to know this book. If they don't accomplish all the other goals in life that the world says they need to accomplish, if I do one thing and I make sure that they respect this book, they know this book, and they live by this book, if we're persistent with that, you see, there have been some generations who've been able to do that spiritually, and Satan has thwarted a lot of that. So this God-likeness, this can only be accomplished by, as it was mentioned last week, by following God's will and purpose. So that being said, this is what you would have participated in had we had that little exercise, is God is true. When you look at Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 10, it's kind of fascinating. You realize that this is during a time of idolatry with God's people. And we're probably a little bit more familiar with Jeremiah 10 and verse 23 than we are 10 and verse 10. But when you look at Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 10, it said, "But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and an everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble, and the nations shall not be able to abide his indignation." Notice it said God is true. He's a true God. In contrast to those that are really not gods. The verse 23 that we're most familiar with said, "O Lord, we know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man to walk to direct his own step," and yet that's what the world tells us to do. Because the world wants to make us God. If we're going to really address the moral issues of our day, we have to start with this foundational understanding of God's goodness. So he's true, and he's honest. A number of things about honesty. If you look at that word, it really means faithful. We make marriage vows, and if we're going to be honest, then we're going to be faithful to those vows. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, there it says that there will no temptation taken us, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful. He will not allow us to be tempted above that we're able, but will with the temptation provide a way of escape. So if we look at God as not only being true, the only true God, and the standard of reality, but we also see him as being trustworthy, as being faithful. If we're God-like, then guess what? We're going to always be truthful, and we're always going to be faithful. We can't hedge in anything in our life. If we say, well, you know, we can tell little white lies, or we can cheat on our income tax. If we start doing those kind of things, that's who we become. There's a standard of goodness that we have to look at and we have to maintain when we see that who God really is. He's just. When you look at Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, or verse 26 rather, again, Paul writing these Roman Christians, he said, "I declare, I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus." Just. How do we determine justice? There are a lot of people that promote justice. Based on what? We talk about social justice. Shouldn't we have social justice? Well, absolutely. What's the standard of it? Well, if you begin to say, well, what we have to do is we have to make up for these things here, rather than to say, here's things we already embody. Here's how we treat everybody. Here's who we are. You see, if God is that ultimate standard, then morality and ethics become meaningful. If he's not, it just depends on how many of us feel this way and how many of you feel that way. And that's how we determine it. So we have to get past those things. God is pure. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 3, it emphasizes for us that this purity of God. And when we think about that, and we specifically understand his purity, then we understand why he expects us to be pure. In 1 John 3 and verse 3, and my fingers are sticking to the pages here. "Every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure." You see, if you compare yourself to me, you may already be pure. In contrast to me, you may be extremely pure. But that's not the standard that we use. That's not the measurement of morality's purity. It is, we are to be pure as he is pure. And God's pure. We'll talk about this later, but our time is going to get away from us. But when you look at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Since he's pure, we're not going to be in his presence if we're not pure. And so we have to be pure in heart, and we hold on to those standards. He's love. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 16 says he's love. There's a lot of discussion about love in our society today, and even in perverted lifestyles. They'll say, well, love conquers all. Define that love for me. You see, really what people are talking about is their lust, their attraction, their passion for a particular person or a particular thing. So we have to get back to the core and say, what are we really talking about when we're talking about not only purity, but when we're talking about love? If God is the essence of goodness, then He's the essence of love. And we base it on what we see in God and what God does. And God's good, and we've talked about that from Matthew chapter 19 and verse 17. If you don't understand who God is, if you really don't recognize His goodness, there's really no way for us to ever measure goodness. No standard for us to have, no moral for us to live by. Now, one passage in closing, and we'll try to stay on time here. Look at Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. A lot of things about Philippians 4 that kind of inspire us when he's telling us that we are not to be worrisome folks, that we are to let our moderation be known unto God, and that we are to let the peace of God that passeth all understanding keep our hearts and our souls through Christ Jesus. But then he says something, and I think this is fascinating. And the reason we wanted to start where we did, and I was going to do that little exercise for us to have etched in our mind who God is. Notice what he says. Here's moral thinking. Here's how we become moral people. Here's how we make moral decisions. This is how we're able to decide moral dilemmas. This is not an oversimplification. It's just where we have to start. Moral thinking is true. Paul said, whatsoever things are true. He's telling folks what to think about. What do you think about? If we get to the point, if we're thinking about something and we can't say it's true, then maybe we ought not think about it. Then he said, whatsoever things are honest. Now, God's true, isn't He? And God's honest. Whatsoever things are true and honest. Whatsoever things are just. Whatsoever things that are pure. Whatsoever things that are lovely. Whatsoever things that are a good report. If they be any virtue, and that word virtue there is our morals. Virtue means moral excellence. If there be any moral excellence, think on these things. You ever just been so angry you could spit nails? Huh? You have to say, about what? Some things we ought to be angry about, but what am I angry about? And if it can't be processed through that true and honest and pure and lovely and just and good framework, then maybe we ought not be angry. Or maybe we ought to change whatever it is, the process that has gotten us in these kind of situations where the anger is provoked. God gets angry. He gets angered towards sin. And so we need to make sure that we are processing our thought through this prism of morality. If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. I want to challenge you between now and next week. Do a little survey. Did the bell ring? Well, I'm not the only one that didn't hear it. Some of you did. So, I'll start winding down then. Between now and next week, I want you to do a little test. This is very private, but I want you to pay real close attention to what you think about. Now, you can write it down or not write it down, but just be conscious what you're thinking about. Maybe every day, just do a little summary. What did I think about today? And then before you go to bed at night, you sit down and read Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, and just say, Are the things that I thought about today, have they been processed through this moral prism that would make me like God? Good. And if not, let's change our thinking. And if we're going to have any impact morally, then he says this is the way you do it. If there's going to be any virtue, if there's going to be any moral excellence, this is how you do it. Because you see, the Lord said, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Now, if we're going to be moral people, where are we going to start? If you're worried about your nation, if you're worried about your children and your grandchildren, where do you start? We've got to start with us. Next week, we'll begin the class by saying, what did you think about this week? No, I'm not going to require you to share it unless you just want to share it. But I want to ask you, and you're going to shake or nod one or the other, did you do any assessment of what you were thinking about this week? So as soon as I turn off this mic, then it starts. If you think, I wish he'd hush, then you process that through true and honest and just and see how that filters. Starting tonight, assess your thinking.